Let me say good morning to everyone. Good morning. Still a little weak. Good morning. Look, let me just start off by uh, acknowledging certainly Harris County Commissioner Rodney Ellis for his work. Yes, please give it up to Commissioner Ellis. And Harris County Public Health for hosting the inaugural Violence Prevention Conference. I think you can all agree that it's a very timely subject and one that needs to be discussed in a very substantive and thoughtful way. Commissioner Ellis and I share a sense of urgency about the need to address gun violence, provide resources to law enforcement, and support the victims of violent crime. And violent crime is a public health crisis made worse by the pandemic and, quite frankly, just way too many guns on our streets. But if we try to discuss it without discussing it in terms of a public health crisis, we will fall far short. Last year, permitless carry, House Bill 1927, became law in Texas, allowing anyone who legally owns a gun to carry it in public without a permit or training or even requiring a permit. And last week, a federal court struck down Texas law prohibiting adults under 21 from carrying handguns. The state of Texas has not changed a single law since Uvalde. And now, as students are returning to school, high school seniors who are just turning 18 can openly carry a handgun. Making gun access with no background checks or training is making it harder to keep our city safe. And when you combine access to guns with all of the other elements that people are having to deal with, it is harder to keep our city safe. Unlicensed carry was a mistake, and now 18-year-olds openly carrying handguns is a recipe for disaster. And our children, and our families, and our communities deserve better. It is true that since the pandemic, major cities across the country have seen a rise in crime. Houston is no exception. The good news is our key categories of violent crime are down, in some cases significantly. Robberies are down more than 7%. Aggravated assaults are down more than 8%. Rapes are down more than 51%. Murders, as of this morning, when I looked at the numbers, was zero in terms of increase from last year, a 0% increase. But so let me dispel something very quickly. Houston is not the murder capital of the world, of the United States. Despite what some may say, even if it comes from the pulpit, Houston is not the most dangerous city in the country. But we know, even though we are seeing these trends in the right direction, there is more work to be done. And that's why in February, I launched One Safe Houston, a comprehensive and holistic crime reduction initiative. This initiative seeks to address crime by focusing on 4 key areas: violence reduction and crime prevention, crisis intervention, response and recovery, youth outreach opportunities, and key community partnerships. And as part of this initiative, Houston hosted, in collaboration with Commissioner Rodney Ellis, the first gun buyback program last month. It was the first gun buyback program in more than 20 years. And using funding from the American Rescue Plan, we planned it so people could exchange gift cards for their guns. And I will tell you, over 845 guns were collected. About $100,000 was issued. It was highly successful. We provided vouchers for a priority place in line for about 150 people who are still waiting to exchange their guns. And we'll see them later in the fall in an A-Leaf area. If we are concerned about violent crime, less guns on the streets of Houston just makes good sense. And this means less guns for criminals to use against Houstonians. And in large part, we need to treat guns like we treated tobacco. We went after the manufacturers on tobacco. Guns are posing even a greater threat. And so we are providing the tools to our police. And let me be clear, we are not defunding them. We're giving them the resources that they need. But we are addressing mental health by trying to get people help instead of simply trying to arrest our way out of a situation. We have increased funding for our crisis intervention response teams, which pair an HPD officer with a licensed civilian clinicians. We are diverting calls when people are in crisis from classified police officers so that they can get the help that they need. We have developed a program that allows officers with iPads to connect with licensed clinicians. And domestic violence is a horrific crime that can lead to broken homes, battered spouses and children, and even murder. We are addressing this critical problem by getting people to safety and getting them the help from the first time law enforcement takes their call. One way is through our domestic abuse response teams, or DORT. This groundbreaking program pairs a trauma-informed officer with a victim advocate who then respond directly to the scene of a domestic violence incident. And on the scene, they can get a victim and their family a safe place to stay, put them in touch with resources, and interrupt the cycle of violence. The city is allocating $2.5 million for the implementation of the Cure Violence program in targeted communities. The Cure Violence model trains and deploys outreach workers and violence interrupters to mitigate conflicts on the street before it becomes violence. And as our children get older, we want to help our young people take steps on the path of good choices. We want to show them as much love, if not greater love, than that we will receive than what they will receive in gains. Our Higher Houston Youth Program provided 14,000 job opportunities for our youth 16 to 24 this summer. The goal next year is to take that number up to 20,000 paid interns for our students 16 to 24. And we want to make sure that they have the access and everything that they need. And then lastly, what I will say, there have been two incidents that have taken place in our city recently. One was a guy who received notice of eviction, burned the place where he was, and waited for people to come out and start shooting them. If we had 50,000 police in the city of Houston, they would not have been able to stop that incident. Another was a man and a woman driving, having a dispute. She gets out, he gets out with a gun and shoots and kills her. If we had 50,000 police in the city of Houston, they would not have been able to prevent that incident. Do we want to provide support to our police? Yes. And are we doing that? Yes. But at the same time, let's be very clear that we are dealing with a public health crisis. And if we don't respond accordingly, we are not going to make our city safe. Lastly, and most of all, we need healthy, safe, clean communities and neighborhoods. You have to invest where people live, and you have to give them what they need so that people don't feel like second-class citizens. And so when it comes to quality housing, parks and green space, business and job and economic opportunities, infrastructure, all of those things that every neighborhood desires and needs are the things that we must do. And when you put it all together, not just one piece, but when you put it all together, you can have a safer community. And then we need people of all persuasions, from the faith-based community and others, to be joining with us to create a very positive and healthy city. And that starts with creating healthy minds and attitudes. I have the privilege this morning of calling on someone, introducing someone who needs no introduction. I have known Commissioner Ellis for a long time. He grew up on the south side of Houston. As he would say, I grew up on the north side. And we have known each other from going back to high school days all the way up. I've watched him on city council. I served with him in the Texas legislature. And now as mayor, I'm serving with him as county commissioner. He is very focused and driven and wants to improve all of our communities. And I am so proud of the fact that he has assembled us today on this violence prevention conference, which I believe will make a difference. If you will, please join me in welcoming to this stage none other than Commissioner Rodney Ellis of Precinct 1.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, brother. Thank you, Mayor Turner. We are very fortunate indeed to have at the helm of power in this city, Mayor Sylvester Turner. Give him another warm round of applause. Barbie, I want to thank you for putting together this conference. It is important. Barbie Robinson is not only a great lawyer, she also has a master's degree in administration from George Washington. She is one of the premier thought leaders in this country. Give Dr. Barbie a warm round of applause. Thank you so much for what you do. I know that all of our congressional people are very supportive of what we are doing, Mayor. I know Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee's staff is here. I want to recognize him, just give him a round of applause. And we are blessed to have great partners on the federal level, all of them, by the way. In particular, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Congressman Al Green, Sylvia Garcia, and Lizzie Fletcher, because they have voted for all of that great money that has come to us so that the city and county can do innovative programs like this. Mayor Turner, you were right on point in walking through those numbers that are so important to talk about what we're doing. We're doing everything that works. We're throwing everything at dealing with crime. You know, if you look around the country, it varies from city to city, from county to county. But by and large, most major cities in the country, their largest expenditure would be in the area of justice and safety. That's no exception here. That's the case for most counties, by the way. In terms of traditional law enforcement, however you cut it, about 40% of what the county spends goes into our great folks with the Sheriff's Department and our constables. A lot of that is for salaries and health care. If you take the entire package of what it takes to run a public safety and justice department, it comes to about 2/3 of the budget, about 64% of the budget. General revenue budget, that's where it goes. I want to open up today's conference with a quote from James Baldwin, a great influential figure that means a lot to Mayor Turner, to me, and including, he means a lot to our keynote speaker today. Here's that quote: "The most dangerous creation of any society is a man who has nothing to lose." Now, if you were saying that today, if Mr. Baldwin was writing it today, he'd probably say the most dangerous creation of any in society is a person who has nothing to lose. The groundbreaking work that we're doing today in partnership with our leaders at City Hall, law enforcement, all of Harris County, public health in particular, is to disrupt and reimagine the systems that contribute to crime, violence, homelessness, and trauma. These are complex issues. No single policy or program can break that cycle. But with the two major initiatives in particular that you're going to focus on these next 2 days, I'm hopeful that we can fundamentally change the way we think about public safety. As I said earlier, these are key components of a much larger vision. A criminal justice system where people aren't locked up solely because they are accused of a crime and they lack financial resources. If one is accused of a crime and you have resources, you find a way to get a good lawyer, you find a way to get out. Law enforcement agencies responding to violent crimes and not mental health emergencies. We call on law enforcement for everything. If you think I'm joking, you think about it. As soon as something goes wrong in your house, who do you tell somebody you're going to call? You tell your children, I'm going to call the law if you don't act right. We call on law enforcement for everything, and it's not right. People having access to a seamless wraparound support system when they're experiencing a crisis, like eviction, substance use disorders, or domestic violence. Trying to make a system where everybody can feel safe regardless of what zip code you might live in. This is not a vision board discussion. It's backed up by the budget at the city, and it's backed up by the budget at the county. At the county, we dedicated $1.4 billion of our annual budget, general operating budget, to public safety. That's the largest amount ever allocated in the history of Harris County. Don't take my word for it. Pull the numbers. They're all online. We've increased law enforcement budgets across the board for everybody. And we allocated millions of federal dollars, ARPA dollars in particular, partnering with the city to address homelessness, poverty, hunger, mental health, gaps in social services, and neighborhood blight. But as we imagine these outcomes and pull all levers that we can get our hands on, we also have to reflect on reality. We live in a state, Texas, where massive voter restrictions are put in place. Because some people think the best path to stay in power is to make it harder for certain people to vote. We live in a county, a massive county, population larger than 26 states, where one single decision on who sits on that 5-person governing board determines the balance of power in this county from 2 different groups that have completely different visions about the best way to deal with these issues in our society. We live in a state, the mayor made reference to it in great detail, with permitless carry laws that give virtually everybody easy access to weapons of war. Our state is a key in terms of focusing on that problem, but it's a problem all around the country. More guns in the hands of individual citizens than you have people in the country. Did you hear what I said? 400 million guns in the country. 300 and some odd million people live in the United States. The Chronicle editorial board recently detailed the same figures the mayor went through about notable drops in violent crime. As the mayor said, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, yet gun violence continues to plague the community. And we have friends in power who talk about everything that contributes to crime, they think, other than the proliferation of guns. That's a no-no. They prefer to ignore that, even when our children are slaughtered at school. That leads me to another quote from today's keynote speaker. There is no wrong time to do the right thing. The time is now for us to build out that vision of a safe and supportive community using proven programs with an eye toward public health, with a belief in our strengths, not our deficits. This morning, I'm honored to be introducing such a powerful and distinguished voice in our collective imagination. Charles Blow. Mr. Blow hails from a little town in Louisiana. He's a graduate of Grambling University. As our keynote speaker, today Mr. Blow will talk about the forward-thinking ways jurisdictions can address violence and what should be considered in that process. He challenges people in power through his opinion pieces and recently published a book. The title is The Devil You Know, a Black Manifesto. His column appears on Mondays and Thursdays in the New York Times. We're also likely to see him moderating town halls on issues that matter on CNN. He's a great commentator. One thing you should know about Mr. Blow is he understands, Mayor, the power of government, in particular local government. He knows how sweeping quality of life decisions are made and implemented, and the impact those decisions have on minoritized and marginalized communities. He knows how systems of oppression show up when we make steps, even if they're incremental steps towards racial justice. And he knows the pack mentality of the politics that we're up against. So without further delay, I want to bring to you someone whose life has been depicted in an opera in New York City. First one directed and composed by an African American. I'm going to ask Mr. Blow a question that I'm sure he'll answer as he continues to speak and in his writings, reflecting and reimagining. Here's a question, Mr. Blow. Where do we go from here? Would you please give a warm Texas ovation to Mr. Charles Blow?
Thank you so much. I normally speak from an iPad and forgot that, so you're gonna have to deal with this big Apple logo all day. So yeah, I want to talk to you really about the connection between violence and poverty. I grew up in a tiny town in North Louisiana, like you just heard. It's in the middle of nowhere, really a little speck on a map. It was about 1,400 people when I was born in 1970. Now it's about half that. It's one of those dying towns. In the 1950s, Interstate 20 was completed just to the north of town, and that drained away all of the traffic and all of the commerce. It dried up opportunities, and it basically flung open the exit doors. But for me, that small town was a perfect microcosm of how violence could become cultural, incubated by poverty and scarcity and dehumanization. Maybe you could say that the town itself was forever linked to violence. Before dawn on May morning in 1934, a posse ambushed Bunny and Clyde just south of town and riddled the car with bullets. Officers towed the car away with the bloody body still inside. They stopped at the local school and let the school kids run out and gawk at the bodies before they traveled on to the parish seat, which is what we call counties in Louisiana. It was about 8 miles away. There, the scene became even more macabre. People rushed to the cars to get souvenirs. They picked up shell casings. They took broken pieces of glass. They cut away part of their dirty or their bloody clothing. One man even pulled out a knife and tried to cut off Clyde's trigger finger. The town became synonymous with the killing. A local bar called itself Bunny and Clyde's Joint, even though Bunny and Clyde had never been there. Every year, the town has a Bunny and Clyde festival, complete with a shootout in the middle of town, even though they were not shot in the middle of town. There are 2 Bunny and Clyde museums, although there's very little in any of those museums that is original to that episode. I remember actually going to one of the museums, one of the old museums when I was a child in the 1970s. I think we were in kindergarten. Now, why on earth they would take kindergartners to see this, I don't know. But we went to see it, and then my recollection is that we saw the car itself, and maybe it was a replica, I don't know. The car itself now is in a casino in Las Vegas. A few years ago, I went to one of these new museums, and I realized, there's nothing new in here. But in the back room, there was 2 mannequins, and they were dressed in period clothing. I got really excited. I said, oh my God. And the caretaker had taken a break from cutting grass at another place and come to open it for me. I said, are these the original clothing? And he kind of looks at it and he says, I think that's my suit. So it wasn't, none of it's real. But that is all to say that the town existed in the shadow of a killing. The one is considered justified and honorable. And maybe that was the first cultural conditioning to violence, but I believe that poverty was an even stronger conditioning to violence. Poverty itself is violent, a psychological violence, one that envelops you and directs you, one from which many people see there's no hope of escape, one that breeds desperation. Being unable to maintain stable housing is a savage reality. Being unable to keep the lights on and the house warm is a savage reality. Being unable to feed the children or yourself is a savage reality. It is all debasing and dehumanizing. In addition, we as a society dehumanize the poor even more, disregarding them and disappearing them. This is one reason that I believe that respect or disrespect becomes such a trigger for violence in poor communities. In a world of institutional disrespect, personal respect becomes a commodity. In a world of little wealth, respect becomes a thing of greater value, one that can be possessed and traded, one that can be withheld and abused. So I grew up with poor people like myself committing extreme acts of violence over acts that they consider to be disrespect. People fought and shot, were maimed, or even killed because of it. When I was a preschooler, our washing machine broke down, so my mother had to go wash clothes at the laundromat. She was there with only one other woman in the laundromat at the time. I was playing outside by the car, trying to keep myself busy. One of my favorite aunts whipped her car into the parking lot, jumped out, waving a pistol, and accusing the woman of sleeping with her husband. The woman and my mother dropped to the floor. My mother yelled at me to get down. My aunt was not a woman prone to hollow threats. She would have surely shot that woman today if she was sure she would not hit my mother or that I would not have seen it. Not long after that, my mother's best friend shot her husband because she found out that he was cheating. As he and the children were watching TV, she stepped from the bedroom, drew her aim at the back of his head. The children screamed. He jumped and turned, and the bullet meant for his head caught him in the stomach. The mother then dressed the children and took them to the parish fair, hoping for him to die while they were away, I suppose. I saw them there that night, eating cotton candy and playing games. The man did not die. He struggled to a phone and called for help. A few years later, I watched as my own mother shot at my father, again for cheating. They were separated at the time, but she had let him back in for an evening, as people often do, lonely and longing for the one that they love, even if that person has hurt them. The next morning, a woman, one of my father's mistresses, had her son call my mother's house and tell my father to meet him at the local juke joint. My mother was outraged and disappointed and embarrassed. He struggled to get dressed and ran across an adjoining field, and my mother fired at him. I don't believe that she meant to shoot him or hit him, but she meant it to scare him and to mark the end of them. But the violence was by no means just among the women in town. Men fought, often to the death. One of my friends in school had a father who I had never seen because he had beat a man to death. That very same friend would go to prison soon after we graduated for shooting a man to death. I watched as my own grandfather pulled a gun on a man during a card game on a carport because he believed that the man had cheated. Disrespect. My mother had to wrestle the gun away from him as we kids watched. I had a cousin who struggled with mental illness and always threatened to cut the throat of anyone who bothered me and my brothers. He did so while flashing a knife. He did so with nervous laughter, and yet everyone knew that he was deadly serious. There was an intellectually disabled boy in town whose mother would beat him so badly that he hid under the house with the dogs. And yet no one reported that abuse or attempted to remove that child. They said collectively, that's not our business. A classmate of my older brother slowly slipped into mental illness that became more and more severe as the years passed. He was a thin boy, very quiet. No one thought him dangerous until the day that he killed both of his parents in a disagreement over food. When the authorities arrived, he was sitting on the steps. His dead parents were inside. They asked him, "Why did you do such a thing?" He was so far gone that he said to the authorities about his dead parents, "Why don't you go inside and ask them?" Violence, sometimes deadly, was the norm for us, the community standard. But as I got older and was regularly in spaces where people were financially comfortable, if not affluent, where hope and aspiration abounded, that I realized that it was the absence of those things that had made my community violence not something particular to those people, not a pathology. Yes, violence is born of individual choices, but a choice always is made in a cultural context. It became clear to me that some people's conditions, their living conditions, acculturated them to violence while the opposite was true of others. Some people simply lived on the verge of existential calamity or psychological distress, like a bucket of water filled to the rim. Any jostling around, anything plunked down into it, and it spills. This is exactly the context that I bring to the most recent surge in violent crimes in cities across the country. That violence is often the convergence of poverty, despair, stress, and inadequate mental supports. This is precisely what we are seeing with the pandemic and its effects. Everything about it adds stress and trauma disproportionately to the people who were already suffering the most. Staying safe and staying sane are harder for some people than others. Healthcare officials told us to stay home and keep social distance, but that's easier said than done for some people. As a report by the Economic Policy Institute pointed out, less than 1 in 5 Black workers and roughly 1 in 6 Hispanic workers are able to work from home. As the report pointed out, only 9.2% of workers in the lowest quartile of the wage distribution can telework, compared to 61.5% of workers in the highest quartile. If you touch people for a living in elder care or child care, if you cut or fix their hair, if you clean their spaces or cook their food, if you drive their cars or build their houses, you can't work from home. Staying home was a privilege. Social distancing was a privilege. The people who couldn't had to make a terrible choice: stay home and risk starvation, or go to work and risk infection. That is the life of the working poor, those slightly above poverty but still struggling. Our entire discussion around the virus was stained with economic elitism. People couldn't empathize with what it truly meant to be poor in this country, to live in too small of a space with too many people, to not have enough money to buy food for long durations, and if you could afford it, to not have a space to store it. People didn't know what it was like to live in a food desert where fresh fruit and vegetables were unavailable and nutrient-deficient junk food is cheap and exists in abundance. Furthermore, in a nation where too many Black people have been made to feel like their lives are constantly under threat, the existence of yet another threat produced less panic. The ability to panic becomes a privilege existing among those who rarely have to do it. And then on a psychological level, COVID cracked us. The mass trauma of the pandemic may actually have produced a form of mass psychosis. The disruption caused incredible societal distress. I think that we can ignore or underestimate the extreme trauma that society has endured and lived with at our own peril. There are millions of fresh graves in America, deaths directly attributable to COVID. The first year of the pandemic brought the largest decline in American life expectancy since 1943 during World War II. There can't be that much death and mourning without severe consequences. But the deaths are only part of the story. There are also all the people who got sick. 94 million Americans have developed COVID, and all of the havoc the virus has wreaked on our lives. Our children couldn't go to school. We couldn't gather and celebrate weddings or graduations or births of babies. We couldn't gather to properly mourn or lay hands on one another or to hug. Human beings are societal creatures. We need to gather. We need to touch and be touched. We need community, but the virus puts some of our basic humanity into suspended animation. Society is aching, grasping, and acting out, sometimes violently. We see the signs all around us. Sometimes it's just a dramatic change in the way we live our lives. As the clinical psychologist Sherry Walling wrote in Fortune, the great resignation where everybody's quitting their jobs now is being caused, or at least fed, by the great grief. As Walling put it, our grief fueled great personal upheaval and pushed many of us to question how we spend our precious finite time on earth, especially considering that a third of it is spent at work. This kind of collective aching manifests in unrestrained, unruly ways as well. Some experts worry that we could see an increase in workplace violence as people begin to return to the office. As one expert told the Society of Human Resources Management, one reason for concern is that many workers continue to struggle with physical, mental, and emotional stress stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic. But that's just what could happen. Increased violence in other areas is already happening. Reports of road rage shootings hit a record high last year. As the advocacy organization Every Time for Gun Safety noted, a person was shot and either injured or killed in a road rage incident every 17 hours on average during 2021. Last year was also the worst year on record for unruly passenger behavior on flights. People are not only spitting and cursing and using racial slurs and punching one another, they are literally attacking. One Southwest airline flight attendant even had a few of her teeth chipped after a passenger attacked her last year. In January, CNN published an article about the number of unruly passengers incidents that rose to the point of needing an investigation by the FAA. From 1995 to 2020, an average of 182 investigations were initiated per year. In 2021, the FAA initiated 1,081 investigations, a 494% increase over the historic average of investigations. We've also seen a surge in violent crime, especially gun violence. Countries like Spain and Britain and Germany also had really bad COVID, but they have not seen the same surge. And that is a disparity that an article published in Time magazine in January attributed in part to the hyper-politicization of American politics. According to the authors, recent research shows that during the pandemic, marginalized communities bore the brunt of the increase in such violence. A forthcoming study shows that the same is true since 2014. Most of those neighborhoods have suffered high rates of violence and poverty for generations. This suffering can be ultimately traced back to policies of racial segregation and disinvestment that began in the early 20th century. For many Americans, particularly those with privilege and means, the pandemic has been inconvenient, a problematic pause. They have been able to bounce back in some way, returning to vacations and parties. But for many people whose lives were already being held together by the thinnest of strings, those strings have snapped. We as a society have more of a lust for punishment than an urge towards empathy. So we are likely to meet this moment with force, more policing, more jailing, more crackdowns, when in fact we need to understand that the soul of society, the most vulnerable parts of society, is bruised and bleeding. What we need is more care. The already hurting have been hurt even more. For instance, a report released by the Pew Research Center found that economic hardships in the first 9 months of the pandemic fell hardest on the lower and middle income families. From 2019 to 2020, the median income of lower income households decreased by 3%, and the median household income for middle income households fell by 2.1%. In contrast, the median income for upper income households in 2020 was almost the same as it was in 2019. While the well-off shopped online and dreamed of delayed vacations, whole swaths of America were falling into even more desperate states. The pandemic wasn't an inconvenience, but instead a life-altering experience, a complete reordering of things, a gateway to more suffering, not just from illness, but also from society's ills. Hunger, trauma, violence. The pandemic exacerbated all three and more, but we don't center therapeutic remedies in our discussion about what is next. We center crackdowns and handouts. We center moving on over getting back up. We center a return to normal over the plight of those whose normal was already not enough. An America now plagued by an endemic disease faces a real challenge. Will we behave differently and do better? Will we care for people rather than cuff people? Will we resort to the responses we often have of not allowing ourselves to truly register the need so that we don't have to truly contend with the need? We already see the answers to some of these questions as police departments across America add budgets and add officers, as public polls show that Americans fear that crime is rising. This isn't public policy, this is public panic. We are in the middle of a national mental health crisis. The Kaiser Family Foundation reports that during the pandemic, about 4 in 10 adults in the US have reported symptoms of anxiety or depression, depressive disorder, a share that has been largely consistent over up from the 1 in 10 adults who reported these symptoms from January to June of 2019. A foundation tracking poll from July of 2020 also found that many adults are reporting specific negative impacts on their mental health and well-being, such as difficulty sleeping or eating, increase in alcohol consumption or abuse, substance abuse, and worsening chronic conditions due to worries and stress over the virus. As the pandemic wears on, ongoing necessary public health measures expose many people to experiencing situations linked to poor health outcomes, such as isolation and job loss. The group Mental Health America reports that the number of people looking online for help with their mental health increased significantly from 2019 to 2021. In 2021, over 5.4 million people took a mental health screen, representing a nearly 500% increase over the number of people who completed a screening in 2019. And these are just the people who are actively seeking the help. Imagine how many people need help, don't know it, or are not seeking it. We cannot arrest our way out of this. We have to heal our way out of this. And we have to think long-term and structurally. We, as a society, created a country that knowingly pushed too many people to the edge and made them live there with too much of a burden and too few resources. When a massive societal stressor came along, it pushed many of those people over. violence was one of the ways that manifested. This is the issue that we have to examine. That is the precipice that we have to walk back from. Thank you so much. Don't know what I'm supposed to do. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for signing this book, all right?
Absolutely, sir.
I'm sorry, forgive me. I have a book I love to read. My question is, you spoke briefly about the onslaught of violence and things like that. So looking at the most recent policies with regard to some of what's going on, trying to wrest our way out of this, what would you suggest in terms of trying to fight those types of policies with an eye on healing and care?
Well, and now I'm stepping beyond my area of expertise. I think that people in this room are better experts at this than I am. So I will just, the novice in me will say this. The issue is the structural issue. Whatever we do in the short term is basically just trying to calm people down. It doesn't deal with the underlying problem. What we have done is create a society of extreme inequality. And we expect people to exist in that extreme inequality peacefully and not bucket, right? And so we create entire structures to keep people docile, peaceful, and absorb the suffering, right? So a lot of our social justice structure is, as we are seeing on the national level, it's never really meant for rich people anyway. There's a guy floating around out there who's done all sorts of illegal things, but it's really hard to put it on him because he's powerful and he's rich. That criminal justice system was never, ever meant to constrain wealthy people and people of power. It was only meant to constrain poor people from bucking the power structure. You steal a candy bar, you're going to jail. You punch somebody in the face, you're going to jail. You steal $1 billion, you may not go to jail. Right? So what we have to, I think the larger issues that we have to examine the system itself and question whether or not we want to live in a society that is creating these structures and creating control mechanisms to make people or force people to live in the imbalance. There are a lot of countries with the same strata of wealth as America where people don't do that. Where grade school education is relatively uniform. We don't do that. We say we want extreme imbalance. We want this school to be able to build a high school to be able to build a $5 million football stadium, and this high school has bugs and cracked windows and old books. We want that. That's what we've said as a society. We want that. We want some people to get sick and die when there is possibility of them having health care because we want the privilege of having good health care for the people with the real money. That's what we say we want. There are other societies where there's universal health care. You don't worry about getting sick, ever, because you can always go to the doctor. We have societies where we build in the possibility and potential for extreme deadly violence. Other societies say we don't want everybody to have a gun. We say we not only want you to have it, we want you to take it to church. We build all this in. We say to some people, we want you to mortgage the rest of your life to go to college. Other societies say college is basically free. It's an extension of your education. The government pays for it. This is the society we chose. We call it meritocracy. We say the people with the smartest, greatest, most inventive people, they should make $1 zillion. Only problem with that is that wealth is self-perpetuating and poverty is sticky. A lot of the people with the money never earned it, but it was passed down and protected. People say, well, maybe you need to work harder. I don't know about you, but the hardest working people I've ever seen up close is poor people. Has nothing to do with effort. It has to do with the society we constructed that keeps people poor and keeps people rich. There is possibility of some movement between those groups, sometimes more than in other countries. But it also means that we have massive poverty. And we accept that massive poverty. So I think what we have to do is to broaden that conversation to say, okay, understand that whatever you're doing right now is the Band-Aid. And maybe it makes people feel better that they have more police presence in the community. And maybe it makes people feel better. And maybe it actually does a good job of reducing some sorts of crimes, the more visible ones anyway. But that doesn't solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is desperation and despair and incredible stress. And you can't scare people, which is what that is meant to do, right? You arrest enough people, punish them more harshly enough, that should scare the other people out of doing what that person did. When you are at the edge, you absorb that risk.
What role does media play in fueling the status quo policies that continue oppression of people of color?
It's too big a question, but I'm going to answer part of it, okay? Which is, first of all, media is a big thing now because it can be social media. There's blogs who are sometimes journalists. There's classic journalists who like the newspaper reporters. There's television media, which is some mix sometimes of news and opinion. So there's a lot of things happening in that space. But one thing that is important to have happen is context. And we don't always get enough of that. For instance, there is no way that we should have more people right now saying that crime is a problem than they were in the 80s when crime was off the charts. But that's the truth. More people today are saying that crime is the biggest problem than in the 80s and 90s when, gang violence was everywhere, crack was everywhere, people were dying left and right. We can provide more of that context around the information that people get. We don't have to, I've seen something that's happened since Uvalde Day, which is every mass shooting comes on like it's a plane crash. What's the point of that? I'm not sure, maybe the point of that is to say, isn't this awful that this happens every day? But what it does psychologically to a viewer is that they keep seeing it. And so in their mind, this is a bigger issue than ever. when in fact, the number of killings is way down from the 90s. So context is an issue, I will say.
One last question, and then we'll get to our break.
Crystal ball question. What is the time frame for correction? 5, 10, next generation, 100 years?
Well, I mean, I guess once I don't know. I always say this, it took us 4 centuries to get into this mess. So it might take a while to get out of it. But what you want to do is to see the trend going in the right direction, see people starting to address an issue. My worry is that I don't see people starting to address it. I still see, on a national level, policies that pathologize. I still see knee-jerk reactions to say the problem is we need to lock up more people. Helps no one. Truth, it literally helps no one. That person is taken out of their family, that person is taken out of their community. There's very little rehabilitation happening in our prison system. So now the income loss in that family is tremendous, not only from the loss of income that person could be producing with training and hope, literally hope, but also the burden, the financial burden in much of the criminal justice system is borne by women who never go to jail. They're supporting someone who got caught up. They're paying legal fees, bonds, putting money on books. That money could be going to their children, education, museum visits. None of this helps anyone. It just helps people with wealth and possessions to feel safer. And then we look back at that family that has been drained by that system and say, why didn't your child perform better? Why didn't you perform? Why didn't you just save up and buy a house? They couldn't save up and buy a house. They've been dealing with this criminal justice system and all the fines and the taxes and trying to get that person home. You know, so I don't know how long it'll be, but I think we have to, I will be more encouraged when I start to see the conversation being focused on the right issue, which is healing the country and the community, rather than a lust for punishment.
Good morning. Good morning. What a powerful keynote address. Wouldn't you all agree? Please give Mr. Blow a round of applause again. Thank you, sir, so much. It was so important for us to have Mr. Blow speak with us today to kick off this inaugural violence prevention conference here in Harris County. We are really in a moment in our community, in our society, to center those services, interventions, and programs that address the root causes of violence. We need law enforcement. They play a critical role. We also need to stem the tide of violence. And we can't continue to cut off the head of a dandelion and expect it to not grow back. That is so critical and important to really reference and think of that analogy, because if we do not take public health approaches, social interventions to address violence in our community, we're really just cutting off the head of the dandelion and not expecting it to grow back. So over the course of the next 2 days, we really hope that you will enjoy the sessions, the experts that are here to share their knowledge across the gamut, from law enforcement strategies to public health interventions, to medical interventions, to mental health interventions, behavioral health strategies. Here in Harris County, under the leadership of Commissioner Ellis, we've been able to implement some really powerful and critical programs that have demonstrated when you take a public health approach, looking at the root cause, you can change the life trajectory of individuals who have not had that opportunity. So as you break out, as you go out today and attend our sessions over the course of today and tomorrow, we really hope that you'll gain some tools, some resources, and information that will enrich the work that you're already doing on the ground. So thank you all for coming today, and next up is our breakout session. So please enjoy, and thank you all for coming.